Well, first I must say I'm very honored to be with such an eminent panel. I'm myself quite a novice at writing about the region, and also very happy to be with the first seminar with AUB. I'm sure this will become quite a tradition. Oh, yeah, I'm gonna talk about economics, so add a little bit to what the previous panel have said. And I'm going to also compensate for the lack of slides. I have 18 slides, but they are not the boring ones showing you unemployment and all the stuff you've seen. Actually, they are different figures, so I hope you will enjoy them. I'm going to stand up so I can see them myself. So, I mean, the question, thank you. I mean, obviously, Islam is, and secularism, you know, it is a very important angle to understand the revolution. But I think that economic interests are at least equally important in understanding the past and in looking at the future. So this is the angle I want to take. And when we think about economics, I mean, the way kind of I develop my intuition is I think of these revolution as really the middle class leaving the autocrats and elite capital and choosing instead to work with the poor and political Islam in a democratic alliance. So that's the intuition that's driving me. And so I think that the two actors that really we don't understand enough, where I think more research and work is needed, are the middle class, which has evolved a whole lot in the past 20 years. Of course, it's difficult to define the middle class because it's in the middle between the rich and the poor. And the rich, that are at the heart of elite capital that has allied itself with the autocrat after the fall of socialism in the 70s and 80s in the Arab world, and the type of crony capitalism that then characterized the region. I mean, to understand our capitalist class and its sociology and the nature of capitalism, I think is very important. So these are the two kind of actors I want to try to describe, and it's research in progress. It's mostly suggestions for, I think, creative angles, I like to think, for looking at these actors. The kind of framework first that I think about that puts these actors together is a variant of the autocratic bargain. The autocratic bargain model has been used a lot to describe the region. We have an autocrat and citizens with some kind of a deal of economics against lack of involvement in politics. It seems to me you need a variant to understand more fully the dynamics of the recent past and the future, and the variant is simply to put the middle class in there, and to think that the middle class, interests vary. They may want to be with the autocrats on, holding the state, or they might want to be with the poor into some kind of a democratic deal, if you like. And so the key is to understand how their interests vary. And the simple intuition is that their interests would depend on whether they look more like the rich or more like the poor. And basically what I want to argue is that over time they looked more like the poor, and therefore they split and led to that change. And there are really two dimensions they want to look at. I want to focus on the economics. They looked more like the poor because the rich got much, much richer. And so taxing them, which is the interest of the poor, became more in the interest of the middle class, taxing the rich and redistributing their wealth. But also they became more like the poor for reasons Richard spoke about, is that political Islam developed and became more, let's say, more popular among the middle class, while initially kind of the core of the autocratic bargain was about the autocrat protecting the secular middle class from political Islam. And that shifted over time, and the repression of political Islam became less acceptable or unacceptable to the middle class. So that's the broad framework that I would use. Let me so quickly go over the state first, which is where these interests play out in terms of taxation and services and the like, and how that evolved over time. And then I will quickly tell you a little bit about new research on understanding the rich and then the middle class. In terms of the state, I find this curve interesting The top curve is the average for all Arab countries of government consumption plus investment. It's not total government spending, it's consumption plus investment. So what it doesn't have is subsidies, and we'll look at subsidies in a minute, and interest payments. And what's interesting is to see how far the rollback of the states has taken place in the region. This is average for all developing countries, the non-rich ones in the Middle East and North Africa. And you see spending has come down from 35% of GDP in the early 80s to something below 25%, 22, 23% in the early 90s. It's an enormous change in terms of spending by the state on goods and services and investments. And what's interesting is that this rollback really happens in the early 90s. And so an important question in my mind is that cannot be by itself the explanation for the revolution. You know, it may have happened 25 years ago. Why did it take so long? And how actually did the autocrat, how did this autocratic bargain survive this massive kind of decline in the role of the state? The other curve you want to notice here, this one, this is private investment over GDP. And I think this also tells a very big story that the rollback of the state did not actually generate kind of a massive response from the private sector. Actually, it's no response at all. This is, again, an average, and there are differences among countries. One needs a country by country. But I think caricaturally, this really tells us kind of the two big events that happen in the region. Point here. Okay. Thank you for helping me. Now, so the question becomes, as I said, how does the autocrat survive? And the simple autocratic bargain model would say, well, the autocrat would survive by giving up political rights and democratizing, which is what we saw in Latin America after the 1980 crisis, for example. But that's not at all what happened in the Middle East. Instead of a political opening, what we saw instead, this is not the right graph, so don't look. So instead of a political opening, what we saw actually, which is what the graph I'll show you, is an increase in repression. And I think that is another very important characteristic of the region, the increase in repression in nearly all countries. And you know, at the same time, you had a lot of reforms. It doesn't work?
No,
It's okay.
Sorry.
Try to fix it. So at the same time, you have lots of reforms leading to a much more kind of neoliberal economic framework. And really the big question then that we have to try to figure out is what's the nature of this economic regime where you have supposedly, you know, markets leading, while at the same time you have a lot of repression and you know, direct political control through repression. You know, how do these systems behave? We are much more used to systems that liberalize politically once they liberalize economically. So that leads us first to try to understand capitalism better. And now, in many ways, thank you.
If you can just use the...
Thank you. Just use that?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just show you these graphs. This is interesting. This shows you actually, and this thanks to Hada that made these graphs, that the black line, as I showed you before, government expenditure came down. However, government subsidies went up a whole lot during this region, during this time. So instead of spending being on you know, goods and services that benefits everybody, like health and education, expenditure on subsidies on particular goods took increasingly a very large share of the budget, here 40% in Egypt, and increasingly those became for energy and oil and gas and petroleum and the kind of goods that benefit the rich much more than the rest of the economy. This is a study again on the incidence of subsidies in Egypt on different income levels. And you see that between urban and rural, nearly 50% of those subsidies accrue to the 20% richest people in the country. So increasingly, those compensated the rich for the lack. This is the same picture in Tunisia. Again, 40% of the budget going now into subsidies. And these are data from SIRI, very interesting. Two indexes, one on repression and one on democratic rights, both showing a decline over the years. Samir showed us that actually the polity index, this one, tells us a slightly different story, but not that different, which is that, nothing works, that, in the Middle East and North Africa we have a slight but not really significant increase. Indeed, the other data set shows that the measures of democracy go down. Okay, so moving to trying to describe the rich and capitalism better. In Tunisia, in Egypt, cronyism, corruption, the capture of the state by the rich has become a big story. They are now all in courts. That veil has fallen. Can we try to understand a little bit more why is it that cronyism basically developed everywhere in the Middle East and in North Africa, and how it will evolve over time? Now, what can be the possible political justification of cronyism? You could think that it could be a way of consolidating power for the elite, that it's defensive, blocking the interest of opponents. For example, we hear of Gamal Mubarak trying to block the interest of the army, that group of Nouveau Riche trying to block the army, or groups that would, say, finance the party, make super profit to finance the party. So that would be, a variant would be that the regime is unable to really regulate these business people, and that they kind of take over the state, and the state becomes a combination of elite capital and kind of the more traditional security apparatus, the intermarry. It becomes a bit of a mafia state. That's a kind of a second possible story. And then there is a possibly positive story, which is that this is industrial policy. It's just the beginning of capitalist accumulation. You give rights to some groups, and they make super profit, and it's a way to grow faster, an East Asian type story. These are three possibilities, and the question I think that is interesting from a research perspective is, can we test empirically which of those kind of characterizes the past best? And I think there are many opportunities now, certainly in Egypt and in Tunisia, to test this. What I want to show you here is an attempt to do that in Egypt using stock market data. This is work with Hamouda Shakir, who is here. Now, of course, the stock market is not where all the action is in Egypt. This is where the action was kind of the group of entrepreneurs that becomes very powerful in the past 10 years with Gamal Mubarak. It's quite orthogonal to the army business or to the business of the Muslim Brotherhood and the informal economy, if you like. But I think it shows very nicely what happens for this particular group. This shows you that the market capitalization in Egypt is very high. Gets up to $140 billion. GDP is 200 billion, so it's a very large share. And the reason why is quite interesting is that the banking rules are very strict in Egypt, actually. And for these new businesses to actually increase their capital, they found a way which was to go to the stock market. So looking at the way their stock behave can tell us a whole lot about the nature of their businesses. And so we do that with this wonderful natural experiment, which is the revolution suddenly happens, the stock market reacts, values move, and one of these lines is the market index, must be somewhere in the middle here. The market basically goes down by 30%. And then we divide the stocks into 4 categories, those that actually go up, those that go down by more than 80%, and all the intermediate situation. And what's interesting is that once the market divides these stocks in these different categories, the categories remain, actually. So the market doesn't change its mind. There are about 100 stocks, and the market knows a lot about these firms. They know about the 30 businessmen, I'll show you their name in a minute, which are very connected, and they are sitting in the Shura Council and in Parliament and in the NPD and in the Economic Center for Economics, Egyptian Center for Economic Studies and various other institutions. And they know of the type of deals that they have, and therefore they appreciate the value of their connections. And so the market tells us here by how much the value of the connections of different types of firm varies once they lose the support of the politicians. So it's an extremely valuable experiment, if you like. These are the names. And so what we've done is once we divide these stocks into these 4 groups, we look at the characteristics of the group that lost most. And basically you find there are lots of connected firms that have lost their connection. You find firms that were privatized, and the market is afraid of labor unrest. And also you find other things like companies selling alcohol and spirit also collapse. And I guess people expect the Muslim Brotherhood to be up there. What's interesting is that these losses due to connections, you can actually look at the values, about $5 billion. So that's broadly the order of magnitude of the value of connections. The connected firms are mostly in domestic industries as opposed to export. They're very connected to housing and related stuff, steel, pipes, cement, food, entertainment. Many of them have been privatized firms that are connected with land deals. Some are monopolies. And so once we know what these firms are, we can ask, okay, what was their role in the past 5 years? I mean, can I characterize their kind of behavior in the past 5 or 10 years to try to discriminate between the various hypotheses about what is chronism for? So you would expect, for example, that if it was industrial policy, we would see these firms investing a lot and growing very fast. On the other hand, if their role was to kind of political stability, financing of the party, you would expect to see high dividend payments, or perhaps they would employ a lot of people that are connected with the regime. On the other hand, if it's purely defensive, to block the Islamists or others from occupying the economic heights, you would expect that simply there'd be low return on investment. So we look at what happens in the past 5 years, and the answer is it's work in progress, so I can't really tell you the answer, unfortunately. But broadly speaking, early results show that you have very high leverage. These firms borrow about twice more than others, so they have very good connections. That they have lower investment, but in all likelihood higher dividends. So they are more into pressing the lemon than into industrial policy, and they tend to have lower profitability ratio also. So all this suggests that it's not industrial policy, unfortunately. It's something else. It's more the hypotheses that go with the consolidation of power. And this is really reinforced by macro evidence. These large firms tend to get most of the credit, in the country. As I told you, they're really after credit. They're very leveraged. But they deliver very little of the jobs. The big companies are those ones. And really between the early 2006, they don't create more jobs than any other firms. They keep the same share of the labor market. And if you look at private investment overall, in Egypt is like the picture I showed you for the whole region. Private investment remains low at somewhere close to 10% of GDP. So really what we have is a crony capitalism that does not deliver. And that's always been kind of the big question in the region. Why is it that we end up with this phenomena? And indeed, it's the same phenomena in many countries. Talked about Egypt, Tunisia, you have the Trabulsi family, you have 20 firms controlling most of the banks. Morocco, you have the palace basically controlling the private sector. Syria is less well understood, and this is where I wanted to show you this. I mean, we know about the barons, the Makhloufs and the Tlas and others that, are the classical cronies that bought cheap the privatized firm or got into the new sectors of tourism and IT and the like. But this phenomena here is very interesting. It's the rise in non-oil export in Syria, which jumps from 1.6 to 8.9 billion dollars basically under Bashar's rule. And these seem to be mostly medium firms, maybe the kids of the Bazaris, exporting to the region. And I think it's really important to understand more what are the political incentives of these business people. To the extent that they export, they're quite different from the Egyptians that work within the protected market. So just to end up on this, why cronism failed, this is really an open question. It's as if basically these capitalists behaved much more than, like roving bandits, if you like, and didn't believe that these regimes will live for very long, and therefore they prefer to press the lemon quickly instead of investing in the future. But I think it's quite a deep question that relates at the end of the day at whether you could run, a competitive economy in a regime that is extremely repressed. And the deeper question is whether it's simply that these autocracies survive for an extra 20 years. They opened up economically, they would have had sooner or later to democratize, and maybe 9/11 and the Gulf War saved them and gave them an extra 2 decades. And these rich capitalists used this extra time to make a bit more extra money. This is kind of bolstered by the fact that capital flight out of Egypt and Tunisia was very high throughout the period. And so lots of these profits were invested abroad. And the rich got much richer. Now, how much richer is tough to say, because what we know about income distribution comes from household surveys. And the rich tends to not fill up these household surveys. So they're not in there. If you look at Tunisia hide their surveys, Egypt, the surveys is there. You look at the highest consumers in the household surveys, they spend like 2,000 pounds a month. These are not very rich people. The rich spend much more than that. And so we have this amazing mystery in Egyptians' income distribution. Not many people know about it, but several do and are looking hard into it, which is the increased divergence between micro household data and macro data over there. If you look at micro data between 2000 and 2009, basically average consumption has not moved. And indeed, at every level of income, welfare is the same. You don't see any improvement at all levels. If you look at macro data, on the other hand, average consumption jumps and average income goes up. The change between 2000 and 2009, the economy grows by 60%, about 30% per capita real term. And so that's in the macro, but not in the micro. Now, of course, maybe the macro number is wrong. But in all likelihood, the fact that the ratio between micro and macro changes by this much, and I'm careful here because my solid is going to come back at this, I'm sure. Because this ratio changes so much, it suggests that really what's happening is that the rich are getting a very large share of the macro gain. And so that gain, you don't see it in the household survey, but you see it in the macro. And, my kind of own sense, and this is an ongoing project, one has to look at many other kind of data to triangulate, but my own sense is that the share of the rich in overall consumption must have increased by at least 27% of GDP between these two periods. So if they started at 10, they're now at close to 40. Which means their share of GDP is even higher than that, and their share of wealth, of course, much higher than that. Now, you may want to compare that to the United States, where the 1% now gets 24% of GDP, up from 15% in the 70s. It's a huge increase. So I have the impression that in the Middle East, it's an even huger increase. And that then changes our perception a whole lot on inequality. In the region, and also on all these growth figures. True, Egypt has grown at 6% a year, but how much of this growth has trickled down, and how much has gone actually to the very rich, and same in Tunisia and in other countries. So I think we need to do much more work with innovative stuff, for example, looking at car registries or things like that, to comprehend this phenomena more. Okay, I've taken too much time. Let me conclude with a few words on the middle class. Now, again, who is the middle class? How large are they? Are they under stress? Did they play this key role in the revolution? These are the key questions. I kind of focus on the upper middle class, and I've looked at, this is again thanks to Hala, we've looked at the share of kind of the upper middle class in the distribution of various countries. And we define upper middle class as those between $4 and $10 a day in real terms. Right? The poor typically are described as $1 or $2 a day. Here we extend it a little bit more to focus on professionals and kind of business people and upper middle class. This is an average for the region as a whole that shows you that it's pretty stable. Of course, it varies per country, and Tunisia gets, for example, much more progress. But broadly speaking, they're stable. I think the big suggestion here is that you have a lot of churning. You basically had public sector workers that were middle class in the 70s and 80s. And after the rollback of the state, many of them become, fall out. And with the beginning of economic liberalization in the 80s, you have traders and industrialists that enter the middle class. So it changes in nature, if not in size, and it becomes, if you like, more autonomous. It's not just bureaucrats working for the state, but it's increasingly people that can become involved politically in a more autonomous manner. Now, how to characterize the economic interest of the middle class? I think economically speaking, the deterioration in public services that happened with the rollback of the state hurt them. Now this is compensated by the fact that they get higher levels of subsidies and kind of low taxes, but they're hurt by this crony, weak economy that doesn't create jobs for their kids. And they're hurt by the rise of the 1% in the following two senses. On the one hand, their aspirations, if you like, rise, or the aspiration of their kids because of all this consumption of the very rich. But also their interests change in that they get much more interested in higher taxation because you could tax the rich. And so I think that's an important element in what I would call here the economic push factor. The corruption of economic liberalism, pushing them away from an autocratic system towards, as I said earlier, an alliance with the poor. You could think of a pull factor, which is, economically the fact that political Islam is less scary, and so you can trust them more on the economic side as well. But you could manage the economy with them. You don't have to rely on the autocrat. And non-economic factors push, Samir talked about foreign relation and the issue of dignity and Israel and the war in the Gulf and all that, and pull the fact that you're not afraid, you don't need protection from political Islam over time. So this push and pull factor, for me, is kind of the equation for the split of the middle class. And it'd be really interesting to test this with your Gallup polls, looking at the opinions of the middle class as they relate to corruption versus to political Islam. And because whether it's more pull or push is very important when we think about the consolidation of democracy in the future. If it's mostly push, then one would not be terribly optimistic because basically you split simply because of how bad the situation is. If it's more pull, you tend to be more optimistic because you're moving, because you think more positively about what the middle class could do in an alternative regime. Okay, taken too much time. Let me conclude. This is the colored image of the split. Okay, this is interesting. Maybe I'll show you this. One question would be, why did this revolution start in Tunisia and Egypt? This is a very interesting graph. This is Gallup actually, show you the perception of how unhappy people are related to their GDP per capita. And you see that Tunisia and Egypt are the least unhappy of all the Arab countries. And they are relatively at a good income level. And so you wonder why the least unhappy rebels first. I think it's very much because these are the countries where that equation works best. This is where the middle class has developed more. This is where there's less fear of what happens after you split from the autocrat. So it's not, in the worst countries where the middle class doesn't exist, where things could explode after, but it's in these countries that it starts. I think it's also, a view of the world that may explain Syria a little bit. In Syria, it's very much a rebellion of the poor. The middle class has not joined. They're afraid of the day after. It's partly because of ethnicity, but maybe also because of economic reasons. We don't know that. And perhaps also because of the position on Israel. I think to conclude, there are two very important questions for the future. One, the old economic challenges in the region. Now that the politics have changed, the political constraints have changed, do we think that these old challenges could be addressed, either differently or with old recipes? Is it politically more acceptable? And the second and very related question is that of consolidation of democracy. Could democracy be consolidated? And it seems to me that the tensions between the rich and the middle class are going to answer a lot of those questions. The actual economic challenges are the following. In the short term, the revolution has been very much experienced as a negative shock. There's been a burst in populism, especially in both Egypt and Tunisia, loss in tourism revenue and the like. And actually, Egypt is moving towards a financial crisis. It will happen a day before or a week after the election. And so how these two classes think about or will behave through this financial crisis, I think would be very important. Now, the key elements of policy that are already contested on the table have to do with improvement in public services. And that seems to depend a lot about the wages in the public service. The possibility of financing that through reduction in subsidies, which hurt the rich a lot, but also the middle class. Would there be a trade-off? The notion of making taxes more progressive, again, very much on the table and dividing the two classes. Improvement in competition, the democratization of credit, support for SME, issues of minimum wage, all of which divide these two groups more or less along class lines. So you may want to think about the structural adjustment program to respond to the financial crisis as done by the rich versus the middle class in alliance with the poor, they would look very different. And I think a lot of what we would see in the next period, in the next few months actually, will be very defining in these classes, kind of defining their interest and adapting future policies to their needs. And the success of those economic policies, it seems to me, would be crucially important in leading to the consolidation of democracy or to its reversal. Voilà. Thank you.